Welcome back to the Gillett Health Podcast. I'm Dr. Kyle Gillett.
And I'm James O'Hara, nurse practitioner. Today is all about carbohydrates and how evil they are or how beneficial they are. So we'll lay out a lot of information, go into a bunch of different niches, and then let you decide if carbohydrates are right for you.
Previously, we've discussed fats and we've discussed proteins. In the future, we will discuss ketones and we'll also discuss fiber, and we'll also have a kind of a separate episode on non-nutritive sweeteners or artificial sweeteners or in between, which we'll explain a little bit more later. But we have a lot of topics today. We will try to put up whatever studies that we talk about on screen as we do to give you the tools to develop a balanced approach to health.
Yeah, and that raises the question of should we include the non-nutritive sweeteners in a AMA nutrition episode if they are non-nutritive?
I suppose so. I guess one of the ways to look at that is it can be very difficult to define what a carbohydrate is, what a fiber is, what an artificial sweetener is, what a natural sweetener is. And even the FDA has changed its mind a couple times and issued a lot of potential warnings and then issued a lot of final declarations. But it's interesting to see that not everything is black and white.
Interesting. So we talked about on a podcast episode a while back where I had a DEXA scan done, and I found out that I have more visceral body fat than I would like to. I have 0.25 pounds of visceral adipose tissue, and I'd like that to be 0.00 pounds of visceral adipose tissue. So I decided the best thing to do after scrolling through Twitter was to cut carbs. Does that sound like a wise plan?
I don't know about that, but I suppose we'll see. Another note off the top of my head on that, I guess that would mean you would have no adipose in the omentum, since it's technically in the peritoneal cavity.
Statistically undetectable, I suppose.
Fair. By the way, a good rule of thumb for how much visceral adipose you should have is 1% of your total body fat. So 0.25 pounds is actually not too bad.
Yep. Just for reassurance for those out there listening who get their DEXA scans like we recommend to see where you are, because we do see outliers where people have a lot more visceral adipose tissue than we'd expect. Alcohol seems to contribute to that.
Definitely.
And people who have much less than you'd expect, even when there's a significant, maybe 50 or 100 pounds of subcutaneous body fat.
Yeah. Not to rabbit trail too much, but we would love it if you would post your visceral adipose level in the comments, and also comment why you think it might be that level, whether it's high, low, or medium.
Someone is definitely going to post a negative number, and we love it.
Ronnie Coleman has negative visceral body fat.
That's right. I think he mentioned that on a podcast.
Negative 0.33%.
All right. So getting into, sort of, I guess, a lot of people's questions around carbs are around athletic performance. Carbohydrates good, carbohydrates bad. Is more protein always better? So we found an interesting data point that actually seemed to be a really good, solid study design and looked at the gut microbiome with different types of diets in endurance exercise. It seems like there's a lot more studies in general looking at endurance exercise. Mm-hmm. And the truth is more protein may not always be better. Endurance exercisers are kind of notorious for being high carb, and whether this is evidence-based or just something that they kind of stumbled onto, I'm not really sure, but if most people are doing that and getting good results, then you would tend to think that higher carbohydrates are better. But what did this study show? What did you find interesting about it?
There's a couple things. In this study, there is really kind of 4 groups of people. But in individuals who so there's 2 groups. There is a high protein group and there is a high carb group. And I believe the breakdown was the same fat percentage in both groups. And then one of the groups had 30%, 30% protein. One of the groups had 10% protein, and the carbohydrates were 40% and 60%. So not a huge difference in the amount of carbs, but a significant difference in the amount of protein, 30% versus 10%. In one of the groups that was higher carb, so 60%, lower protein, their performance significantly improved.
Yeah, and most people would consider 10% protein to be a low protein diet, even by looking at the RDA standards. Like that's a very small number of calories coming from protein. So it may be more of an accurate name here to say, does a, let's say, modest protein versus low protein diet, how does that affect exercise performance? In the study design here, they had people on their normal diet, and then they had them do their normal training. And then they did the intervention diet for a week, which for most endurance athletes, I speculate, would be higher carb at baseline. So maybe these people weren't actually eating 30% of their protein from calories. So probably a net increase in protein, but the study doesn't give us that data, unfortunately. And what they used was the time trial to exhaustion test. And their sort of format for this was they had these people run a 10K, which seems like quite a challenge for myself. I think of that as like, wow, that's really something. And then after the 10K, they have this sort of 95% VO2 max time trial where they see how long they're able to sustain this. And those that were switched to the high protein group, their performance was decreased by about 23%. Those that were randomized to the high carb group, they had about a 6 to 7% improvement in their performance time to exhaustion. So I thought that was interesting. And the study kind of postulates this is all modulated by the microbiome. I don't know whether that's correlation or causation. Maybe they just have more glycogen stores being on a higher carbohydrate diet. And they were able to complete the endurance trial and also the time trial. I'm not super familiar with the nuance of endurance exercise as a field, but I think that there are probably multiple mechanisms at play there, not just, the gut microbiome as a sole driver of these results.
Yeah, parsing out the correlation and causation could be fairly difficult. I do think it's interesting that they looked at the gut microbiome, but reading the full text of the study, I could not find any information regarding which carbohydrates were consumed. So were the carbohydrates, did they include resistant starch, prebiotic fiber? It was hard to tell what if they looked at what specific carbs were consumed, or if they chose specific carbs for the different groups to utilize, then that could tell us more about their effect on the gut microbiome.
Yeah, and that would be relevant because we know that some of these things are going to affect things like the gut microbiome diversity, which trending towards higher protein, 30% protein in this case, led to decreased diversity. Now, it may have been that these athletes are sort of adapted to their usual diet. And if this trial was carried on for, let's say a month, like, would you see that sort of cancel out as the gut microbiome adapted and it was just sort of an interruption of their usual homeostasis that led to the performance declines? I don't really know, but it's an interesting study that's out there. Another one we get a lot about with carbs is as it relates to body composition, weight loss, people trying to improve their health. Should I go low carb? Should I go low fat? I don't think anybody says, should I go low protein now? Because we're wanting to preserve lean body mass if weight loss is the goal. So, there's this talk about, you'll lose a lot more weight on the ketogenic diet. And I think it's becoming more well known that relates to the glycogen stores that become depleted, but not always. Some people will still tout these, the initial weight loss as being greater. And maybe there is sort of like a placebo effect there. Like people think, my diet's working really well because I lost 4 pounds the first week. So what do you think about, low carb, low fat, carbohydrates as part of a diet, cutting out carbohydrates completely, just in the context of not thinking about exercise performance, but just as it relates to, weight loss?
If you completely cut out carbohydrates, so if your goal is to get into ketosis, there is specific benefits, which we will probably get into during the ketone podcast. But a lot of what you're going to lose weight-wise is water weight. For every, let's say, 1 pound of glycogen, I think about 5 pounds of water will follow that. So a lot of the weight that you lose is water weight. And as you mentioned, that is a bit of maybe it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. People like to see results very fast. But with weight loss, as we've discussed many times, you want to have very slow progress. The slower and the more consistent, the better. A lot of times there is stepwise change on the scale. And some of that is also related to like salt balance or even things like creatine. But you're not losing 6 pounds of body fat the first 2 weeks or the first week.
You mean people aren't actually in a 18,000 to 25,000 calorie deficit during the first week?
Yeah. It's kind of funny to talk about, but it is important to remember because it is not uncommon to hear people say, you know, I've done the ketogenic diet or the keto diet 4 different times, and each time I've lost 20 pounds. And really, they've probably only lost 10 pounds each one of those times, if that much.
Yeah. And there's a great graph here. This was, I believe, actually a metabolic ward study where they're looking at energy expenditure. This may have been even some work that was related to the sort of carbohydrate insulin model out there of obesity and weight loss. But you can see, if you're looking at this sort of stepwise decrease here, looking at the ketogenic diet versus the baseline diet, you see that the weight loss is actually a bit slower here, or the fat loss is actually a bit slower here at the beginning of the ketogenic diet, the change in body fat, while the weight loss is actually a bit more rapid. So if you're looking at the first 7 to 10 days, it looks like that's where a lot of the weight loss happens. And then the fat loss actually seems to sort of speed up there. Maybe this is because people are having a bit more satiety, which a lot of people anecdotally eating the ketogenic diet, they find that their satiety is better. Not for everybody, of course, but there are people out there that have done very well with it. So
Yep.
I think that's an interesting graph here in this study. And you can kind of see the opposite. So, people in the health and fitness community or bodybuilding community are familiar with carb loading. And when someone is carb loading, they are usually carb depleted to start. And then there's sort of this glycogen, overcompensation where you introduce all these carbohydrates and then the muscles can kind of keep an extra reserve, it would seem.
Mm-hmm.
So study actually looked at this and you see the exact opposite of here. So, you think cutting out carbohydrates, it's going to pull off more weight, pull off more water. If you do a DEX on somebody that's carb depleted, you're going to see a drop in the lean body mass. But that's a lot of it is water. Just like we've heard many people say, you drink a gallon of water and you get on the DEXA table, you're going to be 8 pounds of lean body mass heavier. But when you look at one study that actually had people that were weight training and then they had one on a ketogenic diet, one on a standard diet, it was week 10 through 11 where they sort of did a carb refeed, replenish these glycogen stores, and they saw lean body mass increase 4.8% that final week, weeks 10 to 11, where these people were adding carbohydrates back into their diet. Now, the protocol is behind a paywall, so we don't know exactly what that looked like. And could you even make that number higher with some sodium and creatine? Probably
so.
But for the average person out there, let's say a 200-pound person, population, 30% body fat, not that uncommon to see nowadays. That person would probably put on about 7 pounds going off keto and adding carbohydrates back in for that week. Now, does that mean that that person added 7 pounds of muscle mass on the DEXA? Yes. In actuality,
lean, dry muscle tissue.
Yeah. In actuality, no. But that just kind of speaks to the recommendations we give about when people are getting DEXA scans to do it very consistently. So usually early in the morning, probably not after a weekend when people tend to have more sodium, alcohol. So maybe midweek and then have a consistent amount of water before each DEXA scan.
Yep. Or you can get it after having traveler's diarrhea or the flu. Just kidding. But yeah, being consistent with that is certainly important. And knowing the difference between the water mass of lean body mass and then lean dry muscle tissue and also bone mineral density, which is another thing that DEXA scans measure is important. So I guess the takeaway is you're not going to put on 7 pounds of lean dry muscle tissue if you just add carbs into your diet.
But you might look like it.
You might.
If you're lean enough.
Yep.
All right. And then there's a lot of attention that gets paid to non-nutritive sweeteners in general. They're getting a lot of press now for altering the gut microbiome, for causing cancers in rodents. They get kind of thrown into these population studies. The nutritional epidemiology is very messy. It's like, well, maybe these people are, unhealthy at baseline, and now they're trying to pivot to artificial sweeteners instead of sugar to lose weight. That's a confounding variable.
Yep. There's
tons and tons of things to account for there. But we found this sort of paper that was an outlier that I was surprised by the results of. The non-nutritive sweeteners in this study were found to lead to more substantial weight loss and better weight loss maintenance. So this was sort of the take home. But a couple things to note about this were the patients, or I guess individuals, participants, were given coupons for non-nutritive sweeteners by Pepsi and other food manufacturing companies. And the selection process, they wanted to account for people that might avoid the non-nutritive sweetened beverages because they didn't like the taste. So they used people that had, were regular consumers of the N&S drinks in their life before the 1-year study period, which is a pretty good time frame, 12 months. And the take home was, that non-nutritive sweeteners were better than drinking just water. So I think that there's a lot of question marks here still, but what could we possibly, speculate as far as mechanism, or is this a strategy that might be helpful for some people?
It is likely that the satiety response can help. Keeping in mind that non-nutritive sweeteners are heterogeneous, so they're not a homogeneous product. They didn't specify if this was allulose. They didn't specify, which is like a lot of non-nutritive sweeteners have calories too. They didn't specify like which sugar alcohol. Is it erythritol? Is it stevia? Is it xylitol? But the takeaway is they're potentially useful as a part of a weight loss regimen. Yes, they'll have other effects on the body, and yes, they will require a podcast exclusively on sweeteners, real sweeteners. We're not real sweeteners, but natural sweeteners, artificial sweeteners in between, and also just including sugars like monk fruit that are often added. So like added sugars. But it's a good takeaway to know that non-nutritive sweeteners are not evil. They're like anything else. This is a recurring theme at this point. And they are potentially useful to add as a weight loss aid.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. You look at some of it's zero sugar energy drinks have become very popular, but people still want them to taste good. They're usually using things like sucralose or erythritol, different things like that in the energy drinks that may not be zero calorie, but they're definitely going to be better than having, something you drink that has 50 grams of sugar in it. Because, across the board, someone switching from, let's say, a full sugar soda to a diet soda seems like a no-brainer for weight loss. And you can argue and speculate about the effects on the gut microbiome and satiety. But if you're looking at, the calories, then it makes a lot of sense going from something that has sugar to something that has substantially less calories, even if it's not zero calorie.
Yeah, it's like an opportunity cost. The opportunity cost of having something that is not sweet, your body will likely seek out something else that is sweet, regardless of its like calorie content.
Yeah, because people do. They crave something that's sweet, and that's a hack, I guess. In the bodybuilding community that's been around for a long time is using something that is incredibly not nutrient dense. So, example, the other day you were eating some strawberries, and you said, "What? They're very calorically." You said not calorically dense, or something to that effect. Because if you look at, and I think maybe even Greg Doucette has done a video of this, a bowl of strawberries versus like a small bag of candy, you can eat a lot more strawberries, the same amount of calories, carbohydrates, and they've also got some nutrient density to them as opposed to like a bag of sugar.
Yeah, I think Greg does a phenomenal job of explaining the difference between calorically dense food versus not. Speaking of bodybuilding trends, a lot of bodybuilders, I think Seth Feroce, have experimented with the keto diet, which is interesting because there's actually been studies done on bodybuilders and ketogenic diets as well.
Yeah, bodybuilders and ketogenic diets, I think that it is overthought a bit. So when you look at bodybuilders, and these were natural bodybuilders, I think around age 27, and they tried to kind of parse out these different hormone levels, differences in body composition. When you go to the actual data and the images and the graphs that they show there's not much of a difference in either way. Now, there was these trend towards, or a very insignificant amount of increased lean body mass in the Western diet group. So by calling it a Western diet, presumably it's not a particularly healthful diet. And one of the effects they were showing was that there were less inflammatory markers, less insulin, less XYZ with the ketogenic diet. But the actual amount of like muscle accrual, slightly more fat loss or weight loss in the ketogenic group, so they were probably eating slightly less calories. They try to even these things out as best as they can, but it just doesn't always happen. And the IGF-1 levels didn't actually drop as much as I thought they would. We know that insulin's a stimulator of IGF-1 release from the liver as well. IGF-1 is going to tend to be lower on a ketogenic diet or a diet lower in carbohydrates. They decreased to about 220 to about 190 in this study, something of that nature. So it wasn't huge. Testosterone was between 600 and 670, something like that for all the participants. So bodybuilders don't always have a 1200 testosterone.
Yeah, surprising. Those were two things that did surprise me in the study. Is you would think that SHBG would increase so much on a ketogenic diet that you would have less metabolism of the testosterone. So I would have thought the total testosterone would have increased, but the free testosterone would have decreased in the ketogenic group. And that did not happen.
Yeah, and one thing we kind of take this study with a grain of salt because there were a total of about 20 participants. So to get things that are statistically powered to show even smaller differences, you really need more participants. So it's something that's out there and interesting, and you can say, okay, based on this, there's probably not a lot of difference. The authors did warn about potentially less lean body mass accrual with ketogenic, but they were, I guess, impressed by the fact that the lean body mass was retained along with this sort of body fat loss. And they may have used bioimpedance for this one. I don't remember it, but I know one of these studies used bioimpedance that we were looking at, and I was like, oh, I'm going to make note of that because it's not as reliable as something like a DEXA.
Yeah, different measures of bioimpedance also have different accuracy. Kind of like different immunoassays have different accuracy as well. Grant Tinsley, a PhD, has recently published a study on different, but if you're going to use bioimpedance, published a study on the accuracy of various ones. On a different note, we like to talk about calories a lot. We've mentioned fat, 9 kcals per gram, alcohol, 7 kcals per gram, almost as much, protein and carbs, both 4 kcals per gram. But a lot of things do not fall into those categories.
So if carbohydrates didn't cause the obesity crisis, maybe it was caused by people not tracking the calories that are in their fiber. What do you think?
Seems pretty unlikely, although some types of fiber that are no longer considered fiber, for example, IMOs, which was previously known as like Vitafiber, they are probably pretty significant, which we'll get into a bit.
So we were just discussing carbohydrates and fiber not being the cause of the obesity epidemic, but some types of fiber had, I guess in the past, prior to these lawsuits, hidden calories in them.
Yeah. I know one YouTuber, kinesiologist Greg Doucette, Coach Greg. He loves to talk about hidden calories in oil and such. And I know he has he also used to incorporate something called Vitafiber or Fiber Yum, which is IMOs, isomaltooligosaccharides. And this was previously classified as fiber. So if you look at the bottle, it'd say like 25 grams of dietary fiber. But the FDA has reclassified this. There's a lawsuit. The company that owned, I believe it was Vitafiber, lost. But anyway, that doesn't matter as much. But anyway, there is several things that are in between fiber and carbohydrates that do not have 4 kcals per gram, like carbs do. And they also do not truly have 0 kcals per gram. In fact, a lot of fibers have calories. And if you eat enough of it, so if you put 25 grams of this fiber, and it has 2 to 3 kcals per gram, and that's probably significant. But if you're only consuming as much fiber as the average American, that's pretty insignificant.
Yeah, and now I think these things are better. Like the fiber that's counted in some of these protein bars now seems to top out around, 1 calorie per gram, and things like the soluble corn fiber. But some of these, I guess, early protein bars from a decade ago may not have had the like 200 calories on the label as actually being 200 calories on the label. Maybe it was more like 250 calories in a protein bar.
Yeah, and perhaps 50 calories won't make a difference, but perhaps it would as well. It just goes to show that even for people that were calorie counting very strictly 5 years ago, that are very knowledgeable about caloric density of foods and how important that is and how important hitting calories are, even they were mistracking.
So it's a good thing I didn't switch out my Pop-Tart habit for a protein bar habit. I might have put on a significant amount of unwanted body weight.
Yeah, I suppose so. On that note, you can't have a carb discussion without talking about complex carbs, simple carbs, Pop-Tart, oats. I know you like to make that example as examples of a carb that maybe one's causing the obesity crisis and then one's not.
Yeah, people blame grains as a whole on the, I guess now outdated food pyramid being the foundation.
Mm-hmm.
And Pop-Tarts, when I was, this is approaching a decade ago now, I was getting a lot of calories from Pop-Tarts when I was a very broke college student, as many college students do. Pop-Tarts and ramen noodles are very palatable and very cheap. And I wasn't fooled by the label on Pop-Tarts that said 7 vitamins and minerals. I didn't think to myself, oh, look at this healthy, balanced breakfast. I knew that it was 90% added sugars that was not going to have a good effect on my health. But I think people will, sort of point to oatmeal, which is another heavy carbohydrate food, and say, how could this possibly be healthy? Look at how many carbs this has in it. So people blame carbs and grains instead of kind of looking at, I guess one of these gems from the nutritional epidemiology is we know what foods people are eating, what foods people are not eating, and what the recommendations are. And what's out of line with recommendations is the amount of refined grains people are eating. 80+% of people eat too many refined grains, and complex carbohydrates are well below the recommended intake. 80% of people are not eating enough complex carbohydrates. Mm-hmm. So trading the Pop-Tarts for oatmeal is a huge leap for somebody. But if people are going to be very confused, they're like, well, I not eat my Pop-Tarts, but if I eat oatmeal, that's just as bad as eating Pop-Tarts because they both have carbohydrates. It's a very confusing landscape if someone just goes online and they're like, are carbs bad? They're going to find a lot of information that may or may not play out because it's very individualized. Someone who just found out that they're a diabetic, I think there is some merit to decreasing carbohydrates, but long term, it's really going to come down to the adiposity that is driving that, unless they're, of course, a type 1 diabetic, something of that nature.
Yeah, it's a good example. Even looking at individual countries and the types of carbs they consume, you can plot that and have a pretty reasonable expectation of what the prevalence of obesity will be in that country. So that there's one study and it took a ratio of the, I believe it was simple carbs on top or like ultra processed carbohydrates. And then they put it through some statistician magic. And then they had complex carbohydrates on the bottom. And then using that ratio, they did a linear plot and they could see, yes, there's a pretty significant correlation with the type of carbs and the prevalence of obesity in the different countries, even when you account for which countries are the most or the least developed.
Yeah, and I think I've made that reference before. Like if you take a very undeveloped country and you give everyone a $60,000 per year salary and you put a McDonald's on every corner, you're going to see a lot of the same problems because it's in part an environmental cue, an environmental drive that we have to push back against when we're looking at, why did this happen? So it was a really interesting plot, and the general association was more simple carbohydrates, less complex carbohydrates. You're going to see more obesity on average. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what about carbohydrates as supplements for exercise specifically? So, there's a lot of people out there who are, drinking 100 grams of carbs while they're lifting weights because they need that extra fuel. Now, tons and tons of liquid carbohydrates when someone's running a marathon, that has a pretty solid database, a pretty solid data set that shows they probably do need to replace some of those carbohydrates. But for people who are weightlifting, I don't think the effects are that potent, and I don't think that they need quite that high of a dose. So looking at, this study here, they had people that drank a control drink that actually had amino acids in it, because a lot of people are taking BCAAs during their workouts because those are going to feed the muscles. And then they had a relatively low carbohydrate intake. So it was 15, 30, and then 45 grams of carbohydrates taken in over an hour. So this was a 2-to-1 ratio of glucose to fructose, which is interesting because when you look at the amount of glucose or the amount of fructose that somebody can absorb, you can actually get a little bit more absorption if you have a mixture of both of them. Just because the way they're metabolized, I don't know the specifics there, but the net result is getting more carbohydrates into your system in a shorter time period.
Some sweet synergy. Yeah. Another proven correlation is cyclists. So it's not just having to do with running. Any ultra endurance event, it makes sense. And I remember one study on cyclists, the higher the level, for example, professional cyclists, or I think they looked at a specific race and how many carbs were consumed. The very, very skilled ones tended to have a much stronger correlation with how they did. So what that tells me is if you're a professional athlete and you're doing endurance events, then carbohydrates can be very important. Whereas if you're not, then it's not as important of a difference. Another interesting category of people that you could look at for like pre-workout or intra-workout carbohydrates is people that are on keto diets. For example, maybe a power lifter that was on a keto diet.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see a large sample of CGM data, people who are ketogenic working out. And it's like, do they see that same, rise in glucose that they need to use as fuel? Because it's not uncommon to see exercise spiking glucose. People like to worry about that because spiking glucose is bad, but exercise has a lot of short-term things you would look at in the blood work and say, oh wow, this is bad. But then we know that based on how that plays out in the long term, that exercise is probably the best thing you can do for overall health and longevity.
Yeah, some things like hyperbaric oxygen and exercise, you probably do want to have plenty of glucose and energy substrate around.
Yeah, that's a great point. Now, going back to the liquid carbohydrates that people were taking in, we can kind of look at the numbers here. So for bench press, the average number of reps was 9.7 for the control. And then when you had 15 grams of glucose, people got an extra 2.5 reps on their bench press. So is it a huge difference? Are they doubling their output? No, but you can make the case that it has a small ergogenic benefit. And you see the same thing with, the bent over row. Somebody's getting an extra rep, doing a couple more reps of curls, and, seeing that 15 to 30 is kind of your peak. And actually with too much glucose, it seems like you have a bell-shaped curve where too much glucose, 60 grams, actually seems to be impairing their exercise performance. So maybe these people are having lots of carbs and feeling very sleepy while they're working out. It's hard to say.
Yeah, that is interesting. And I don't know if we'll ever fully understand the causation behind that. But there appears to be not only a law of diminishing returns, it begins to become detrimental.
Yeah, counterproductive. So if you're drinking 100 grams of glucose while you're in the gym, you might reconsider backing off to somewhere between 15 and 30 grams of carb over your hour workout. And I would argue if you're working out and you're in there less than 30 or 40 minutes, you probably don't need to replace that glucose unless you're trying to squeeze out an extra couple percent in terms of your exercise capacity.
Yep. For those that are on the GOMAD diet, the gallon of milk a day diet, you might be asking, is lactose just as efficacious? And I guess the answer to that would be there's a lot of other things that you would probably want to be thinking about first. But it is a carbohydrate.
Yeah. You wouldn't want to mix like 1 part glucose, 1 part fructose, and 1 part lactose, perhaps?
Maybe it depends on the person.
And if they are lactose tolerant.
Yeah. Maybe for a toddler.
So that's been our brief overview of carbohydrates. Like we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, we'll definitely go into more specifics here with dietary fiber, non-nutritive sweeteners, take a dive into the literature as far as the effects on gut microbiome. So let us know in the comments what specific questions you have as it relates to those subjects. We do take note of those things and use them to kind of guide our future podcasts. We want to know what you're interested in hearing. But I think that's enough for today. This was a lot of fun looking up, a lot of interesting data points there, and we appreciate your time.
Absolutely. As always, thank you for your time, and may God bless you with health and happiness.